The first speaker is Professor Henry Falk, and he will speak on global climate issues and the relevance to public health. Dr. Henry Falk served in multiple capacities at the United States Center for Disease Control. So he is representing this continent. And he was director of the National Center for Environmental Health. So that is something where you really know what you're talking about. Currently, he is adjunct professor at Rollins School of Public Health, Emory University. At CDC, he helped to start the environmental health, injury, disaster epidemiology, and hazardous waste investigations, and a variety of other programs. So he has a broad knowledge. He is the recipient of several awards, including the CDC Lifetime Science Achievement Award, the Distinguished Service Award of the US Public Health Service, and the William C. Watson Medal of Excellence at CDC. So when you hear this, it's hard to find a better speaker for setting the scene of the relevance of climate change to public health, and we are looking at his personal background. Dr. Falk, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you, and want to extend my thanks and greetings to Mr. D.A. Prasanna, Professor Rajani Prasanna, and all the good work that they have done in Manipal, to Dr. Venkatesh, to Dr. Brand, and to many of my new friends like Dr. Prabhakaran Purnima and Dr. Nadav Davidovich, and to especially to Dr. Sheth, who has provided a lot of guidance for me in this work. I have been to India maybe 24 times, starting with my honeymoon. So, and then the Bhopal chemical plant accident. So I do have some experience in India in my background, and I hope, that I don't sound too foreign. So my goal is to address the public health issues related to climate change. So what I would like to do is, in this introductory talk, to provide a very brief framework for how to think about the public health issues. You will hear many more details on the specific public health problems in the succeeding talks. So I divide the public health effects into 3 broad categories. Let me start with the first, which are the acute effects from extreme weather events. This is what we all hear about. We see this in the news every day, has media coverage. These are urgent threats, and they seem to be getting worse. So it catches the public's attention. Now, these events don't come labeled as climate induced. We can't say for any specific event whether it might have happened otherwise, but cumulatively, these acute events happen more frequently, they are more severe, and they are plausibly related to climate change in ways that I will try to explain. So, for example, in the US, we have had increasing numbers of hurricanes and storms. They are of greater severity than in the past. In the last 5 or 10 or 15 years, we've had many more large category storms than in the previous 40 years. And partially it's because they pick up energy from the warming Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. The storm surges are greater. They become rapidly increased storms literally overnight. They pick up water vapor from the warm weather. They dump lots of rainfall. They cause lots of flooding. So we have a much more destructive pattern to these storms than we used to have. Similarly, we have heat waves where we didn't expect them. 121 degrees in Canada, the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Oregon, 117 degrees. So this is not Phoenix or Atlanta. These are northern cities where we didn't expect it. And we also have prolonged wildfires, which we didn't have. And the wildfires, again, have changed. The tree levels go up higher in the mountains, and the wildfires can cross mountains that they couldn't do in the past. So what are the health effects that we worry about from these acute disasters? So first off, there's a certain amount of acute mortality and the injuries related to these events. In historic terms, they are maybe not huge. We get, let's say, sometimes thousands of deaths in the US, like from Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Maria. But with modern civil defense, evacuation routes, warning sirens, and with all of the current technology we have for preventing the ravages of storms, we have unexpected amount of mortality. Similarly, we have chronic conditions are exacerbated in these situations. People who have diabetes, heart disease, they lose access to pharmacies, to medical care. We get exacerbation of a lot of existing diseases. And then there are specific features related to each of these kinds of, let's say, disaster events. So wildfires lead to a certain amount of air pollution and burn injuries. The flooding leads to, in the southern United States, the cities marinate in the heat and you get incredible amounts of mold, leading to respiratory disease. And then the large evacuations and relocations of people, for example, the entire city of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. And many of those people don't actually come back to the city. They become sort of internal refugees in some sense. They lose jobs, they enter into poverty. You get exacerbation of chronic disease, you get an impact on childhood diseases, all from the relocations, loss of jobs, and dependency. And we in the US are much better at dealing with the acute end of the disaster than in the long-term remediation. So we're not always able to help, particularly the poor and vulnerable people impacted by storms. And of course, the common denominator to all disasters is mental health impact. We see that particularly in children and vulnerable groups after every disaster. So the second category um, of the climate-related health impact relates to what I would call prolonged disasters, permanent heat waves, ongoing drought, ongoing effects of on coastlines. We had a CDC director who used to use the terms urgent threats for things that come out of the ordinary, like a hurricane, and urgent realities for things that we live with all the time, but which are equally urgent in their impact. We just have gotten used to living with them. So, for example, there's no doubt in my mind that in California, in the US, where they are dealing with wildfires now for extended periods, year after year, internal displacements, drought, and so on, this will have an impact on California, which will carry through into disease within the population. In Florida, as an example, the coastal areas have grown rapidly in the last decades, as is true in all of the US. It's true in many other cities around the world and on the coasts, Shanghai, Mumbai, Dhaka, and so on. And we will see the impact from the storm, from flooding and the constant impact on the coastline. In India, the World Bank report suggested not just coastlines will be involved, but a World Bank report suggested that there are hotspots all over South Asia in which there will be intense heat, which will have considerable socioeconomic impact. Um, and the Middle East, other parts of the world as well. So what are the health effects from the prolonged direct effects? Partially be more of what the acute problems are. All the coastal changes and the relocations will have impacts on healthcare and on vulnerable groups. Um, these are slow motion kinds of disasters in which you see the disaster effects extended over long periods of time with population disruptions, prolonged relocations, challenges in education, challenges in nutrition, lack of healthcare, loss of jobs, potential effects on chronic disease, maternal and child health and malnutrition, and of course, mental health impact. So the third category of what I would like to talk about are what many people call indirect effects of climate change on health. They happen through the environment, for example, and indirect to me always sounds like it's maybe not quite as important. I would call them maybe complex effects of climate change on human health. So here's how it will work. It'll affect all parts of society. So you will have changing patterns of disease vectors. As the temperature changes, the vectors move. So you have extensions of problems like dengue fever, chikungunya, malaria, diarrheal diseases, and pathogens, foodborne diseases, all of which will be shifting as the climate shifts. There are changing patterns of vegetation, which in places like the US will affect pollen. The pollen counts will vary. They will go up in many places, and you'll get increases in allergic, asthma, and respiratory diseases. There will be changing atmospheric patterns, which will impact air pollution, particularly particulate matter and ozone, and that can lead to increases on the health effects of air pollution, which are varied: respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, maybe dementia, maybe cataracts. There's a long list of diseases related to air pollution. And of course, in a place like India, where there has been extensive air pollution in the past decade, this will exacerbate that problem. There will be changes in environmental and occupational risks due to shifts in industry as the climate varies, and to changes in agriculture. You could have increased pesticide use. So all of this will have an increased exposure to toxic chemicals and the kinds of illnesses that would be related to workplace exposures and toxic chemicals. Finally, changes in agricultural patterns will lead to shifts in nutrition and food quality, with potential effects of malnutrition and long change impact on food-related illnesses. So, and again, of course, mental health with all these shifts. So I think all of us have gotten used to living in a world where we are constantly hoping for improvement. The danger from climate change is that we could be looking at several decades where we are going backwards in achievements related to public health as a result of all these climate effects, which will be shocking to us. A large Swiss insurance company estimated 10 to 15% decline in the standard of living in the next several decades, which could affect all kinds of illnesses, including even something like suicide. So let me conclude by saying that many people feel that if we could only cast the climate change issue as a public health issue, it would catch on more easily with the public. They would understand it better and take it more seriously. I always, as a public health person, I always thought this was a good idea. Now it's a little more questionable. We've lived through COVID, and we understand that people sometimes have many values which compete with public health and the right thing to do. But in any event, we hope that, as Dr. Bren mentioned at the COP26 meeting in Glasgow next month, that there will be a much better presentation of the public health issues of climate change, and there are international groups preparing to make those presentations and put that on the agenda. So the public health aspects of climate change will undoubtedly get a more complete hearing in next month and in the coming years. So thank you very much.